Do you ever get scared? Really scared? What sort of things most frighten you? The kind of fear that keeps you up in the middle of the night, tossing and turning, unable to sleep, nervous and anxious. Is it health problems, financial problems, marriage or family problems, loss, failure, uncertainty? We all have those nights, don't we? Sometimes endlessly, actually becoming our days, right? Author Max Lucado, in his book Fearless, writes, "Each sunrise seems to bring fresh reason to fear. They're talking layoffs at work, slowdowns in the economy, flare-ups in the Middle East, turndowns in the housing market, upswings in global warming. Some demented dictators collecting nuclear warheads the way others collect fine wines. The plague of our day, terrorism, begins with the word, terror. News programs disgorge enough hand-wringing information to warrant an advisory, caution. This news report is best viewed in the confines of an underground bunker in Iceland. We fear being sued, finishing last, going broke. We fear the mole on the back, the new kid on the block, the sound of the clock as it ticks closer to the grave. We sophisticate investment plans, create elaborate security systems, and legislate stronger military, yet we depend on mood-altering drugs more than any other generation in history. Moreover, as researchers tell us, ordinary children today are more fearful than psychiatric patients were in the 1950s. Fear, it seems, has taken a 100-year lease on the building next door and has set up shop. Oversized and rude, fear is unwilling to share the heart with happiness. Happiness complies and leaves. Do you ever see the two together? Can one be happy and afraid at the same time? Clear thinking and afraid? Confident and afraid? Merciful and afraid? No. Fear is the big bully in the high school hallway, brash, loud, and unproductive. For all the noise fear makes and room it takes, though, fear does little good. Fear never wrote a symphony or a poem, a peace treaty, or cured a disease. Fear never pulled a family out of poverty or a country out of bigotry. Fear never saved a marriage or a business. Courage did that. Faith did that. People who refused to consult or cower to their timidities did that. But fear itself? Fear herds us into a prison and slams the door. Wouldn't it be great to walk out? Walking out on the prison of fear. This is something of what I'd like to talk about this morning. Today we begin a new series in which we're going to study one of the most important characters in the Bible. Indeed, one of the most important characters in all of human history, namely Moses. His story, which frames the story of the Exodus, that is, the deliverance of the people of Israel out of slavery in Egypt, is generally understood to be the defining event in the Jewish faith, and as such is the defining event to our Christian faith as well. It is foundational to the whole Judeo-Christian world. To understand ourselves, we really need to know Moses. And as we will discover, this is a story of an individual, but an individual story rich with profound universal themes. Human sin and God's love, captivity and freedom, rebellion and faithfulness, brokenness and new life, divine providence and human responsibility and participation. Now, to give you a sense of where all this is headed, this is a gigantic story, a huge story. It takes up 4 whole books of the Bible: Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So we're going to break this up into 3 main parts, each with a short break between each one. Part 1, we're going to look at Moses' early years and the formation of his character. Then in Part 2, we'll look at the Exodus itself, the escape from Egypt. And then finally, in Part 3, we'll look at the journey to the Promised Land. This morning, we begin with the background to this great drama, the setting, the context, if you will. It's the first chapter of Exodus, which links the conclusion of the book of Genesis, the opening book of the Bible, with the story of Moses. The key verse here being verse 8, a seemingly minor piece of information, yet one which we quickly see has profound repercussions. It says, "Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph." Now, the book of Genesis concluded with the story of Joseph, and that's not the That's not the husband of Mary, but rather a few thousand years earlier, one of the 12 sons of Jacob. Jacob, also known as Israel, being the grandson of Abraham, in whom the story of God's people and the work of salvation begins. As you may recall, when we looked at the story of Joseph some time back, through a long series of events, Joseph wound up in Egypt, eventually rising to a position of power within the Egyptian government and bringing his whole family to live there with him. And this is the way the book of Genesis ends, with the people of Israel, all the family of Jacob, happy and settled and prosperous and beloved in the land of Egypt. Life is good for all concerned. But then a new king arose who did not know Joseph. Exactly. You know, even without anything else being said, if you know the backstory, you know that this spells trouble, right? You know? If this were a movie, the soundtrack would probably have an ominous chord by the low strings played here. Uh-oh, something's coming, right? Genesis ended happy. And now as Exodus begins, the situation has changed dramatically. Years have passed, generations. This new king, he doesn't know this backstory, right? As he looks out over his kingdom, he doesn't see a blessing. Quite the opposite. He sees a threat, right? These Israelites, they're growing in number and prosperity, and he sets about seeking to squelch this threat. Curiously, however, at this point, there is absolutely no danger. There's not even any problem on the horizon, but all the king of Egypt can see is trouble ahead. And so he acts on this, seeking to crush the people of Israel in a preemptive strike, right? Ironically, though, through precisely this, actually bringing upon himself all the destruction that he most feared. It's a self-fulfilling, self-destructing prophecy driven by fear. And this is what sets the whole story in motion. It's fear. Fear mishandled. One frightened individual giving free rein to their anxiety, letting it run free to their own and many others' demise. A message to us all in coping with the fears that so often overtake us. I mean, fear is part of life. It's part of our protective mechanism, but can also very easily, as here, lead to our downfall. How do we keep it straight, you know? What do we learn from just this opening scene here that we might not make the same mistakes? Well, as we start into this story, I'd like to offer just two starter thoughts for dealing with and hopefully defeating the fear that so often seeks to overcome and destroy us when life suddenly hangs a bend and we find ourselves facing some frightening situation. Two thoughts. Thought number one, risk yourself. As noted, the new king of Egypt sees a threat on the horizon, and his automatic response is self-preservation. Pull in and protect, right? This, of course, is always the initial response of all fear. We pull into ourselves, right? This even happens physically. When you get scared, have you ever noticed how your extremities, your hands and your feet, they get all cold and clammy? This is because the blood pulls into the core for our protection, right? It's the automatic response of fear. Pull in and protect. In the case of the king of Egypt, this particularly taking the form of violence. First in enslavement, then eventually, as we will see, moving on to outright murder, seeking to remove the danger at all costs, right? Well, imagine if instead of seeking to crush the Israelites here, he had instead reached out to them in simple friendship to help and support them and to try to build a good relationship with them instead of trying to crush them. Instead of pulling into himself, imagine if he had risked going on to care for them, right? Imagine how differently his story might have gone. Instead of winding up on the bad end of things, Egypt might have ended up being a blessing as being a nation who sought to help God's people and the whole work of salvation. And this points us to our first lesson here. When we become frightened, we pull into ourselves, often with hurtful, violent side effects, cutting ourselves off from others, lashing out in unkindness. It's natural, but it's not always healthy. First thing this text teaches us being that we need to fight this. When we become presented with a frightening situation, instead of pulling into ourselves, to instead break the power of fear over us by seeking to reach out beyond ourselves. Instead of letting the fear confine us, instead to break its boundaries, to step out of its prison by doing the opposite of what it desires of us. Basically, when you become frightened, break the power of that fear over you by instead risking yourself to reach out beyond yourself. Particularly to help someone else, to help them and not just protect yourself. As John the Apostle wrote, perfect love casts out fear. Perfect love casts out fear. So very simply, if fear is overtaking you, right, seek to become a more loving person. That's step one. More outgoing and caring rather than inward and protective. When you're sitting in the waiting room, scared to death about what the doctor is going to tell you, instead of just hunkering down and pulling in, look around the room and see who else is scared and how you might do something to lift them up. When you're struggling with your finances and you can't see how you're going to get all the bills paid, instead of just tightening your belt, take a point to give a little bit more away to those in need, to the causes that move you. When your marriage is in trouble, or your family is falling apart, or your job is in jeopardy, or you're struggling with a loss and you don't see how you can overcome it, instead of just retreating into your own mind, into your own troubling thoughts, look around wherever you find yourself and see who you can minister to, right? Instead of protecting yourself, risk yourself for somebody else. I mean, I know it doesn't make any sense, but trust me, it breaks the power of fear and it sets you free. Author Jenna Hopton writes, a number of years ago, our church was invited by the members of another nearby Methodist church to attend their 100th anniversary. They were holding a potluck dinner on the occasion, so that night I made up one of my famous broccoli and cheese casseroles, and we loaded up the family and headed over for the dinner. Now, our church is in a comfortable suburban area, but this other church was in a very tough urban area. We had never been there before. Driving through the city, we suddenly found ourselves in a horrible part of town. Bombed out buildings, burned up cars, gangs on street corners. We were scared to death. My constant prayer was, Lord, just get us there and just get it back home alive, right? At just about the worst place in the trip, we pulled up to an intersection and the light turned red, and I thought, oh, please don't make us stop. Go green, go green, go green, right? Suddenly my husband said, though, hey, look at that. And he pointed to some homeless men huddled around a fire that was glowing from an old garbage can. With that, as the light changed, my husband pulled the car over to the curb. I asked him what on earth he was doing, that we shouldn't stop here. But he replied, it doesn't make any sense for us to take a casserole over to a church dinner with a bunch of other fat Methodists. When right there are some guys who could really use the food. He grabbed the casserole out of my hands and the paper plates and plastic forks I had brought along and got out of the car and walked over and offered the food to the homeless men. As I watched, I could see they were overjoyed. They immediately set about devouring the meal, and after my husband had talked to them for a moment, they nodded their thanks and he returned to the car. Needless to say, now the whole mood in the car had changed dramatically. We were no longer afraid, but we were empowered. This was the best trip of our lives. Forget Disney World, And from that day on, my teenage son coined a phrase that has become something of our family motto. Whenever we face some scary situation, we laugh and we say, I am not afraid. I have broccoli and know how to use it. Right? Yeah. When fear shows up, instead of pulling in, reach out. Right? Thought number one in breaking free of the prison of fear, risk yourself. And then from this thought number two, go for the ride. Once again, returning to the text, the new king of Egypt, he looks out over the situation before him, and while there is no problem whatsoever at the time, he assumes that the worst is going to happen, right? It may or may not, but he acts based upon this presupposition and thus sets in motion all sorts of trouble that eventually befalls him. And this once again points us to a lot of the problems we often get into with our own fears. First of all, how often are we frightened of things that haven't happened and may never happen, right? As my sister, she often likes to put it, she says that she spends most of her time building bridges over rivers she never has to cross, right? Can't we all relate to that? Right? Total waste of time. Even better, as the king of Egypt here, in which the problem before him is not actually a problem necessarily, but just a new situation. How often is the thing we fear not actually something bad, but just something different? It's something new, and we're getting all worked up for nothing. I remember once hearing a preacher put it this way. He said, my great-grandfather rode a horse, but was afraid of trains. My grandfather rode on trains, but was afraid of cars. My father drove a car, but was afraid of planes. And I fly in planes, but am afraid of horses. So many of our fears are not something really bad, they're just something different to us, right? Something new. Unfounded fears, fears of simple change, but most especially as with the king of Egypt here, looking at our lives, right, and assuming the worst. Why do we always do that, right? Why don't we ever assume the best? I mean, we do believe in a loving God, don't we? Don't we? That was a little slow and weak, guys. I mean, give me a break. We believe in a God who wants the very best for us always, who can work wonders. So why don't we ever assume the best, right? This is the second key step in battling fear. Assume the best. That is, when life confronts you with some threat, some danger, some fear, don't automatically fight the situation, resist it, and refuse it, but instead, try to go with it. Knowing that God can not only bring something good out of the worst situation, but even more that oftentimes it takes some of the worst situations to work life's greatest blessings for us. So often when we face some sort of frightening situation, our entire goal becomes, like the king of Egypt before us, we're going to keep this thing from happening. We're going to block it. We're going to stop it. We're going to avoid it. This is our constant greatest prayer. However, if we look at the Bible, we see that the message there is very different. The constant message of Scripture is not that God's goal in our life, the goal of faith, is to enable us to avoid life's problems, to keep us from them, but rather for us to be able to travel through them, whatever they are, with God's help, always onto something greater. For instance, we are not taught to say, "The Lord is my shepherd, yea, so that I can avoid the valley of the shadow of death." But rather, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." The goal is not avoidance, but a sharing that transforms the experience. As it has been said, Christ didn't come to exempt us from life's trials, but to fill them with his transforming presence. Now, this obviously doesn't mean going around looking for trouble. I mean, who would do that? But rather, it's simply recognizing that God is always working the best for us, and for us to then be seeking this out, seeking that unexpected blessing in every adversity, even more seeking to be transformed by our problems, to enter into them in that way. Quite often, the worst things that happen to us become some of God's greatest blessings to us, if we're willing to let God work that on us, Quit fighting your fears, resisting them, and instead try to go for the ride, Open your heart to how God is seeking to work something even greater for you from right within the fear. Preacher Leonard Sweet offers his personal illustration on precisely this idea, and he writes, "It was my first stewardship campaign. As a brand new pastor, I had been appointed by the bishop to a missionary church in a small college community in New York's Genesee Valley. The first year had been a nervous one for both me, a young, not dry behind the ears pastor and wetback PhD, and the congregation, which was comprised of an odd and unconsummated coupling of rural folk and academic types. It was a tough crowd. I was so scared. I so desperately wanted to do well and to prove my worth, my greatest fear being to louse up in some way. Well, after my first year there, things had gone well enough to warrant the belief that we could double the budget for the year ahead and really grow our ministry. If only we had a slogan, some catchy motto or a jingle around which to design our new development campaign and really catch the congregation's enthusiasm. Or so I thought. The weekend before the Stewardship Sunday kickoff, I sought some solitary confinement in Toronto, Canada. There, I hit first upon a slogan and then an idea. Why not have T-shirts made up for the every member canvassers who would call on parishioners, emblazoned with my new brainstormed, inspiring stewardship theme? It seemed like the perfect plan. Well, during the community concerns times of the morning worship the next Sunday, the chair of the campaign, Doug Clapper, did an outstanding job of making the committee's case for this controversial financial leap forward. As soon as he finished, I bolted to the front, prevented him from returning to his seat, and presented him with a surprise gift that I announced confidently would give our campaign focus and force. The color of Doug's face when he unwrapped his surprise gift should have alerted me as to what was to come. His embarrassed refusal to hold up the T-shirt for all to see, "No, you do it," he nervously chuckled, was another missed signal. But it was not until the very moment that I held up that T-shirt and announced that there were enough of these surprise gifts for every one of our members to wear that I realized exactly what I had done. For printed in big bold letters on the shirt, I proudly displayed our new stewardship slogan would be, "I upped my pledge, up yours." All right? Needless to say, I had lost it. At first there was a trickling giggle and then a torrent of laughter. I tried now to preach, but convulsions of laughter drowned out my sermon at unpredictable moments, ebbing and flowing like a moonshine tide. You see, Sweet's greatest fear had come completely to life, and he concludes, "But that moment of my greatest embarrassment and mistake, a moment from which that worship service never fully recovered, was the moment of my ministry's recovery in that community. For suddenly this upstart preacher and hotshot PhD became extremely human and could do something so outrageously stupid and foolish that it redeemed all his jarring strangeness. From that Sunday on, I became their pastor and was bonded to them for life. We loved each other deeply and we were one. And for the next 7 years, as I walked the streets of the village, I would find myself frequently greeted with the question, 'Are you the up yours pastor?' Right? My point in all of this, lighten up. Lighten up, church. Lighten up, people of God. We so often spend our entire lives constantly trying to remain in control, to protect ourselves from any harm, never realizing that some of the very best moments only occur when we lose it, when our worst fears overtake us in the hands of a most loving God. I upped my pledge, up yours." It has been said that fear knocked at the door, faith answered, and no one was there. Defeat the fear that seeks to overtake your life. Risk yourself and go for the ride. Let us join together in singing our closing hymn, number 129 in the red hymnal, "Give to the winds thy fears." Would you please stand?